So, ich bin schon in der Vorbereitung der Keynote. Wer hier irgendwie schauen, dass unser Referent gut versorgt ist. Wir freuen uns wirklich, dass er gekommen ist, und weil er einen englischen Vortrag halten wird, werde ich jetzt gleich zu Englisch switchen, um ihn vorzustellen. So, ladies and gentlemen, please let me introduce to you our keynote speaker, Evgeny Morozov. Did I say it right? Perfect. Okay, I just tell a little bit about you and then I will ask you to the stage. He's an American writer and researcher from Belarus. He's an expert on political and social implications of technology. He was named one of 28 most influential Europeans by the American political journalism company Politico. So this is really something. I think please read his Wikipedia page. It's really impressive and I can't tell you everything about it. So already as a student, he was a visiting scholar at Stanford. He was Yahoo Fellow at Georgetown University and Fellow at the Open Society Institute, and he made his PhD at Harvard. He wrote articles and columns for a long list of newspapers and magazines like New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Guardian, New Yorker, Corriere della Sera, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, and so on. Maybe one day Kronenzeitung, who knows? And in nobody knows. In 2011, he published his first book, with the title The Net Delusion, The Dark Side of Internet Freedom, and the second should then follow 2013 with the title To Save Everything, Click Here. So let's say the core message of his work is keep a critical view on technology solutionism and think about political and social implications. So I think he's really the right man to have our keynote here, and please welcome with me Evgeny Morozov.
Okay, sure. All right. Is this working, this mic? Okay. Maybe I'll speak into this if you don't mind. For me, it will be a bit better. Good morning, everyone. Fortunately, I'm not an American writer by any means. I actually no longer even live in the United States, so still on my Belarusian passport, even though I have an Italian wife. So that said, I'm very happy to be here this morning and to share some insights with you about where I think the debate about digitalization in cities is going, and point also to some of the more problematic aspects of it, especially those that became visible in the last few years as what the so-called big tech, the Googles, the Amazons, the Ubers, the Airbnbs of this world started moving very aggressively and massively into cities, right? And I think that the debate we are having now, it's not just about some abstract, neutral force of technology or digitization. I think we all agree that, by and large, this is a good force. The debate we are having, rather, is to what extent there is a political economy of digitization, and to what extent it makes sense politically, democratically, culturally to surrender or to delegate, if you want to be more diplomatic, so much power to how our cities work, how basic services work, to this big tech, right? And with all of the following implications, that most of these companies are either American or Chinese, that they all are involved to some extent in various geopolitical fights that the countries and governments behind them are fighting, that there are all sorts of security implications behind delegating them so much power and so much responsibility, and all of that, I think, is quite clear to you. Let me start, though, by saying that cities, of course, have always played a very important role in our political process, right? This will not be new to any one of you, but I think their role has particularly become prominent in the last 10 or 12 years, ever since the last financial crisis, right? We have come to see cities both to some extent as places where the crisis generated, right? Because so much of it was triggered by this excessive borrowing in order to buy houses and in order to essentially create an illusion of wealth and income when the economy itself was in rather bad shape. So we have seen that cities have had a very problematic role themselves in triggering the crisis to some extent. But cities have also been places where a lot of the contestation, right, and protest following the crisis happened. We have seen entire new city administrations, like for example in Barcelona, come into power on the force of this public sentiment, right, where you had social housing movements nominate their leaders as mayors and win elections. We have seen all of that happen as well. So cities, to some extent, in 2019, represent a very interesting phenomenon. Right? On the one hand, the old rhetoric of real estate, but also some infrastructure as keys to prosperity, right? As keys to making the current global economy work and deliver. That narrative still holds. Right? We are still expected to get a house, to invest in it, use it as our main source of income, perhaps find new and better ways to make money out of it with Airbnb or with other similar platforms. To this idea that the city is still the place where kind of all of the problems of capitalism eventually go away and this economic model delivers, that narrative still holds. So if you look at the rhetoric of Uber, if you look at the rhetoric of Airbnb, if you look at the rhetoric of this new unit within Google called Sidewalk Labs, which is actually building digital cities, all of them are premised on this idea of extremely smooth, frictionless, highly efficient city where data helps to run everything efficiently, where you can analyze everything in real time, where you can prevent people who might not meet certain criteria from accessing certain services. It's the idea of a city that is privately administered and it's done in an extremely efficient manner, and it works mostly for one class of people in that city, and also people who are property owners who have, things to lose. So the question of minorities, the question of people from different ethnic backgrounds, the question of people who are renting, for example, rather than buying property, it's not really a big concern to those who are promoting this model of a highly financialized but also highly digitized city, right? And I think that a lot of people who have stable, high-paying jobs in the creative industry, they find, or in the financial industry for that matter, they find this proposition of a highly efficient life organized entirely by big tech, they find it very appealing. And this is why if you go to a city like San Francisco, you will see that those working in the tech industry have every single need of theirs taken care of. There is an app or a startup that would do everything for them, fold their laundry, cook their food, deliver their kids to kindergarten. Essentially, everything revolves around making your life more efficient so you can spend more time working for Google or Apple or Facebook or something else, right? Which, of course, is a vision which one would expect from this kind of post-Fordist American model, but that still looks quite horrific to people who are used to the generosity of the welfare system in Europe, who are used to a much more, let's say, well-being optimized model. So I think that we are going to hear much more from big tech, from the likes of Google and Amazon and Microsoft about the benefits and the positive sides of this model, right? And I think they will continue pushing it, and it might actually seem that this model is delivering. Because for the time being, and for the last 5 years or so, this model has been extremely cost-efficient and cheap. So if you look at what users have been paying, for example, when they were taking an Uber, right? Those rides were in fact much cheaper and much more slicker and efficient and pleasant probably than the rides in many taxi companies. right? And that has created this expectation and the mindset of not just the consumers, but also the public administrators who are dealing with these companies, that this new digital economy represents a major departure that can lead to sustainability, efficiency, cost savings, and so forth. So, if you look at the average fares, as I've said, that you would pay for an Uber ride, they would on average be, 20 or 30% less than a normal ride you would take with a taxi. And as long as we have trained citizens to think as cost-optimizing consumers, that proposition appears quite attractive. The problem is that we have spent very little time trying to understand how did this low cost come about? What are the factors that have made Uber services so cheap? Right? And I think that the default assumption that a lot of us make is that we have entered this new era of Industry 4.0 or smart mobility, of smart cities, where data somehow introduces these terrific efficiencies and everything becomes just much easier to manage and thus cheaper to manage. Right? If you look, of course, at the actual data, if you look at, for example, the impact of many of these ride-sharing companies on traffic, you will see that their own studies suggest that the greater activity of Uber in a city like Los Angeles, for example, actually leads to increases in traffic and congestion and does not reduce it. So the argument about the efficiency of this and of this being the new cutting-edge, more sustainable mode of transportation, they don't hold water even if you don't look at the cost structure of those services. Very often they actually reduce efficiency and not increase it. But if you look at the cost structure of those services, you will see that essentially the lower costs that we are paying, and in many cases those services are free, right? And I will talk about that as well. There is clearly this rationale of extracting data which accounts for the fact that they're free, but that aside, if you look at Uber, you still pay something, right? But if you look at it closely enough, you will see that those cost savings are essentially a function of two things. One is that a lot of those costs are pushed onto the driver, so the drivers end up with no social protection, no insurance, they have to buy their own car, they have to take a loan to pay for that car. I mean, it's basically the workforce that has to subsidize consumption by having inferior work conditions, right, in which they work, which is the more visible and, I would say, obvious element of this low price. But the second element, which most of us have not understood properly, is that many of these firms are heavily subsidized by their few funders. Because the idea is that they need to reach a certain size, right? Because they're all platforms, that's the term that's used. And as long as they are platforms, they can scale. So you can have the same Uber app running in Vietnam or in Cambodia or in Belgium or in Brazil. It doesn't matter because it all rounds out of the same operating system, right, on your phone, whether it's Android or Apple. So the idea is that essentially, in order for these companies to scale, you need to have people with deep pockets standing behind them who can afford to subsidize and cover their losses for almost an indefinite period of time, until they reach the scale at which they can make profit. So for the last 5 or 10 years, we have been living in this period of great subsidy of our transportation services to some extent, but also many other services, by venture capital. And more by sovereign capital, coming from sovereign wealth funds like those of Saudi Arabia and the various Gulf countries, but also Southeastern Asian countries as well. What this means in practice is that the reason why you pay so much less for Uber than you would pay to a taxi company is because there is the government of Saudi Arabia that has decided to give quite a lot of billions to Uber so that Uber can continue losing the billions it's losing every year and stay in business. So, if you look at how much money Uber has lost just this year, I think it's more than $5 billion, right? And we are not even in December. And if you can continue losing so much money every year, and this is also what they lost last year, if you can continue losing that much money on an annual basis and still stay in business, how could possibly any other company compete with you? Unless you have the same deep pockets and you can sustain losses for so long, it's basically impossible. Right? I'm saying all of this just to show you that there is a certain logic built into this model, and this logic connects us in ways that we do not expect to various trends in global capitalism in general. Right? And it's obvious that because of the broader financial climate of the last 10 years and the absence of profitable opportunities to invest into elsewhere, in part because of the low interest rate environment and other factors, a lot of the global capital that has been standing idle has found its way into tech. And a lot of the governments and companies and essentially money holders that would previously invest in bonds or stocks or maybe some small entrepreneurial venture in their own country, they now invest into these big giant digital platforms, which increasingly to operate need to be present in cities because this is how they can scale, because this is where all of those kind of upper class creative industry types who need Uber and Airbnb and others actually live and work. Right, so I think without understanding that background, it's very hard to understand what we are up against. Right, and when you're understanding that, you're essentially dealing with one of the consequences, right, of the financial crisis here. It's not just some kind of a natural extension of digitization. It's actually a pretty logical consequence of where we have been. Am I not loud enough? Okay. You start understanding that it's also not very reasonable to expect cities and city administrations, even if they are the most progressive and participatory and equality and egalitarian oriented as you can find, it's not reasonable to expect them to be able to tackle that problem on its own. In part because the amounts of political leverage, geopolitical leverage, but also capital investment needed to resolve many of those issues, they are massive. Right? It's a problem that has to be tackled on a national level and on a European level, as long as we would like to think about it as a European problem. Because even in the case of Uber, the example that I've given you before, it's obvious that these companies are not run by idiots, or at least not all of them and not all of the time. Some of them are run by idiots, as you have seen probably this week was the implosion of this company called WeWork, right, which was supposed to go public and which actually occupies quite a prominent role in modern cities because they are the leading provider of co-working spaces, right? And in the case of WeWork, the model was very simple. It was almost the same as Uber. You have one massive funder, SoftBank. Money comes in from funds like those of Saudi Arabia. They keep pouring more money into it, and because they are the main funder behind this entity, it keeps the valuations high, right? So because you can always invest more money and you're the only investor, you can say, okay, this company is worth 50 billion. And now I'd like to invest 10 more billion, and now the company is worth 80 billion, right? So this can continue for a while, but the moment that these companies hit the road, so to say, and try to go public and invite outside investors, this bubble crashes and collapses. So some of them are run by charlatans and fraudsters, and there is clearly a bubble behind it, which again has to do with the fact that capital is so idle and has no other outlets. But that aside, there is clearly an expectation inside a company like Uber that they will eventually become profitable, right? It might not happen this year, it might not happen next year, but once they manage to expand from just transportation into delivery, into logistics, into, running some basic infrastructural services, connecting maybe all of your different transportation layers because they get all the data, the idea is that they will be able to make money. And one of the ways in which that will become even faster is because they would be able to get all the people and all the labor out of the loop, because they would be able to replace them with AI. That's the idea. And you can say that this is naive, this is not realistic, that's not going to happen in the next 5 years. But I would argue that we will be seeing many of these developments unfold much sooner than we think. Because for a company like Uber, it makes total sense to be investing $5 or $10 billion into artificial intelligence every year, as long as they can reduce the most important cost center, which of course are labor costs. Right? So they would be doing it, and they would be doing it fast. And if we really want to find some kind of an alternative model, we really need to start asking questions about the political economy of artificial intelligence and to what extent any alternative configuration of platforms, apps, algorithms, data networks would even be possible if we lose control of some of these basic elements of infrastructure, right? If artificial intelligence becomes a service to be provided by just 4 or 5 private companies, how much leverage would city administrations, trade unions, even national governments have vis-a-vis those firms? You look already at a country like the United Kingdom, where there has been a massive push by the National Health Service to integrate as many services from big tech as possible into how they provide healthcare, partly because of cost reasons, right? So already see one unit of Google called DeepMind integrating itself into the welfare state and the national health system to analyze the data of patients. You see now Amazon pitching its Alexa service, again to the National Health Service, thinking that it will be useful when patients need to look up some of the symptoms that they have. You see all sorts of devices and sensors being given out to healthy people even, so that they can monitor their symptoms and, if necessary, save a trip to the doctor because they will detect their problem sooner. Right? I'm not saying that all of those are bad or unnecessary, but at some point we really need to start asking questions about dependencies. Right? And to what extent the degree of dependence that we are now creating is actually healthy, and to what extent any sort of leverage that the public authorities used to have over the private contractors would actually remain in a world where Amazon runs half of your backend, if not the entire backend of your city, and Uber runs half of your transportation system, and Google pitches its services to run everything from your museums to your city districts, as they are now doing in Toronto, as I've said, right? Where there is now a very vibrant debate and a vibrant opposition movement, because the city of Toronto does want Google to build a major quarter of the city, right? And offer all sorts of services there, from transportation to garbage collection to monitoring of lights and so forth. And of course, these companies can do all of that. It's not obvious, though, who's going to pay for all those goodies, right? And this is where I still think that the advice I've been trying to kind of hint at throughout my talk, that we have to follow the money, it's very useful. Because it's not obvious why these companies would be doing all of that at expense to themselves. Right? Clearly they will not be. And if they won't be, the question is who will eventually end up paying for that, how sustainable those models be and are, and how we can basically, and whether we can actually trust them to remain what they are, given the shifting profit and loss-oriented imperatives of these companies. Because you don't know if tomorrow they will decide to pivot to another area and say that, well, okay, we've been running transportation for a while, but tomorrow we would like to run food delivery. Right? And in a digital economy like ours, where everything is driven by profitability, essentially, and by expectations of just a handful of funders behind those companies, these decisions can be taken overnight. So there is no security whatsoever. You cannot count on them to stay in the business they are in and do it forever. If I were you, I wouldn't count on Facebook, for example, being free or even existing in the form that it exists now 5 years from now. Because despite the fact that we talk about these companies as monopolies and we talk about them abusing their market power, we have to understand that they all compete and respond to each other in various domains. So it's true that Facebook does not compete with other social networks, but Facebook definitely competes with Google, Amazon, Twitter, and others in many different facets. So they definitely compete with Google when it comes to advertising, and they definitely compete with Twitter when it comes to advertising. All of this is to say is that the foundations of the digital economy are much more fragile than we think, and that this entire relatively stable structure can, if not collapse, then take a very different form within a year. All that would take as a coordinated effort in Washington, Berlin, and let's say Beijing, right? And this can actually radically reshape how the digital economy functions. And I'm not saying that that will necessarily be in the benefit of citizens. All I'm saying is that we cannot expect this model to stay in place and be of great use to citizens. It might be for short periods of time, and I'll be the first one to acknowledge that we've all had a good time at the expense of Saudi Arabia, and its wealth fund in the last 10 years because they have subsidized a lot of the services we've been using. Whether this can continue, I have no idea. That's why I think it's time that we start thinking, as I said, about the political economy of digitalization, and we start thinking about alternative models of providing services and building and operating and owning infrastructures. We have a set of decisions to make. There are a lot of people now who would like to treat data, for example, as a commodity, right? And cities where data is treated as a commodity would be very different cities from those that treat it as a common good. To me, this seems obvious that, yes, I generate a lot of personal data in my bedroom, my health data is my data. There is no argument about that. But I also generate a lot of data socially. I generate it in the social context. The fact that I'm here in the room with you generates data. And it's not obvious to me that that data should belong to people who have built the sensors in this room or to Google, who has put so many phones into our pockets, which can sense the environment and tell us how busy or empty this room is. Right now, this is what happens, right? And if we further formalize this with a very rigid system of property rights, for example, we can end up in an environment where if you really want to build anything out of the ecosystem controlled by Google and Amazon, you will essentially need to pay your own citizens for the data that you have perhaps as a taxpayer already funded in one way or another, right? And those are the very problematic cases where I think we need to think much harder at the beginning to set up the foundations of this new digital economy in a way that citizens and workers and all the other parties that still somehow think in a mentality that's not entirely dominated by just price optimization and consumption will still be able to have a say, right? Because if we abandon this idea and if we just operate on the assumption that this economy should run smoothly and efficiently, and there will be maybe 20% who will definitely win, 60% who will be neutral, and 20% that will definitely lose. Is it a good enough distribution or not? I mean, I don't know. A city where everything is recorded, where there are facial recognition systems everywhere, where you have some kind of a digital system for awarding bonuses and punishments, the way that China has been doing with its social credit system. Is it a city where we would like to live? I mean, clearly for a lot of people, it will be a city that would be fantastic and marvelous, just like Singapore is for a lot of people who go to Singapore. It's secure, it's efficient, it works, but then you start chewing gum and you spew it and you end up in prison. So do we want that as a model where it would clearly be much easier to enact that kind of control with ubiquitous surveillance and ubiquitous data collection? Or do we want to turn it into something else, where data might be also enabling new forms of collective action, new forms of solidarity, where people might actually understand that they have similar needs and that many of their problems are not to be solved by an app because it's just so easy to install, but they actually have to be tackled socially and politically through some kind of a public intervention? Because it's not obvious to me that the best alternative, if you and your fellow citizens always have a transportation need, is to call an Uber. I mean, I have no doubt that an Uber will arrive and there will be 5 or 10 of them, and 10 Ubers will take all 10 residents of the same house at the same destination. But if that's really the problem you're trying to solve, maybe what you really need is a bus, right? And not 10 Ubers, right? But the question is, do we even build the knowledge infrastructure and the action infrastructure that will make it easier for us to understand and perceive our shared needs and then act upon them? Or would we somehow build our digital economy in a way where all of our needs will be satisfied privately and in a way that's extremely inefficient, that's very often ecologically indefensible and unsustainable, and in a way that would often create more problems than it would solve, even though it might eventually make a company like Uber profitable, right? And I think that we need to spend much more attention thinking about how to build these infrastructures, right? Of revealing our needs to each other, of understanding what are some of the trends and tendencies inside those needs, and of constructing and facilitating basic building blocks through which citizens, abetted perhaps by the state and abetted by all sorts of other public institutions, would be able to act collectively. Right? And I think this is a vision that Silicon Valley would never deliver to us, because there is nothing in it for them. It's not a system that big funders of Silicon Valley, like the Saudi Arabia's Wealth Fund, would like to fund. I don't think that the Chinese tech companies would like to fund it either. All that remains at this point are European public institutions, national institutions, cities, and various public authorities like trade unions and chambers like this one. I mean, those are the players that still have an alternative logic inside their DNA, so to say, and they're not just focused on privatizing our needs and then creating privatized solutions to them. I mean, the whole tempo and the whole rhythm of the current digital economy, it's very simple, right? It's basically creating more problems so that you can then create and sell more solutions to them in a perpetual cycle, right? So, you have a problem with cybersecurity. Why? Because Microsoft or some other software provider does not really want anybody else to examine their code, and they're very uptight about what it is that they allow other people to see. So it generates loopholes in the system, which hackers then exploit. And instead of us regulating Microsoft and blaming it on them and forcing them to do something about their system, we turn to Microsoft and purchase even more services from them that will protect us from hackers. I mean, that is the paradigm on which the modern economy and public-private cooperation currently operates. It's finding ourselves so vulnerable and so dysfunctional that the only people who can save us are the people who created the problems in the first place. And I know that I'm exaggerating to some extent, but I think it captures very nicely this impotence that we're currently witnessing in many public institutions. And I think that the only way to get out of it is to get out of this mentality, right? And we need to make sure that we actually try to think beyond just finding these privatized solutions to every problem. Some European cities have started walking, or at least experimenting with this alternative logic. I mean, I myself have spent the last few years spending quite a lot of time in Barcelona, for example, not least because my wife was actually its chief technology officer, so I observed it quite closely, the transformation that Barcelona was undergoing as a city. And I can tell you that, of course, it's a much more challenging process than anybody has thought and imagined. There are many structural barriers that stand in the path of the cities. I mean, even including, by the way, European regulations and including various trade commitments that our national and European bodies make, which then make it impossible for a city to ban a company like Uber or a company like Airbnb just because it will be seen as an offense against free trade. So all of that is true. And it's also true that the tools are quite limited. You by the nature of many of the, as you know much better than me perhaps, as the nature of many rules on how you run tenders, for example, right? How you do public contracts, it prevents you from favoring companies and organizations that do something perhaps better but more expensively, because it's the cost that determines who gets the contract. And if that's your only criteria, it's no wonder that you end up with Google, Microsoft, Cisco, or Ernst & Young, or whoever running the show forever, right? So there are many things that we need to rethink, and there are many laws, I think, that we need to reshape. But a basic step, I think, that's missing is the almost political and philosophical one. Right? We need to understand what kind of a different digital economy we want, and that the digital economy and digital society we have experienced in the last 25 years has been a society shaped almost entirely in the United States almost entirely on the American kind of conception of what communal and urban life is. And, would you really trust a company from Palo Alto to run your cities? I mean, if you've been to Palo Alto, I wouldn't. And, I've spent 2 years in Palo Alto, so I can tell you that a company that has its residence there does not know much about what cities ought to be, because it's a very big village, essentially, right? So we have to be quite mindful about those things, right? And we have to understand that we can articulate an alternative model, and we need to translate that model into concrete steps. And as I've said, starting with data is a good step. Understanding artificial intelligence and the amount of money that will need to go into it is another good step. We need to understand that ultimately, big tech at this point is one of the few sectors of the digital and global economy, actually, that still delivers, right? Even if the gains are mostly fake and fictitious and they're only just reflected in the skyrocketing stock prices. Nonetheless, this is where the money goes. And as long as the money goes there, even if you manage to create something that's good and efficient and perhaps driven by solidarity and considerations that are other than profit, as long as it's something that's a commercial entity, you'll have the Chinese firms and the American firms coming and buying it. And we have seen that in Europe for the last 5 or 10 years, right? And unless there are similar strategic funds at the European level, if not at the national level, they can step in and play the role, but with a good agenda. Similar to the role that, let's say, Saudi Arabia plays with a somewhat dubious agenda, I think we would already be making quite a lot of progress. Because otherwise, we are just creating fantastic products to be later integrated into American or Chinese big tech. I can give you one example of a European project funded by the European Commission that I've been involved with. And it was an effort to create basically this small decentralized technologies that can help us take on the likes of Google and Amazon and Facebook. And as all European projects, it has a dozen partners. Some of them are commercial entities, some of them are academics, some of them are cities. You probably know how the European projects work. And ultimately, having received quite a few millions from the European Commission, the most promising academic project inside this joint venture eventually was bought by Facebook. Its academics were brought under Facebook's roof. And now it's the key component part of this digital currency that Facebook has created called Libra. Right? And if those are the rules according to which European innovation is financed and produced, we have to start asking ourselves whether we are actually using the money and our tax money that we are giving to the Commission and elsewhere to essentially fund the development of this fantastic R&D, which then has no other chance of survival other than being sold to the American or Chinese big tech. Because there is very little in Europe that can integrate or protect it on its own. Right? And I give you that example only to show you that the kind of decisions we need to make are not just philosophical and political and moral and intellectual, they're also very pragmatic. And I think we need to start making them now, because if we don't, we will stand no chance in Europe of trying to define an alternative model to the highly libertarian American one or to the highly controlled, hierarchical, centralized Chinese one. Right? So we still have a few years left, and I think cities have a very important role to play, not least because they're still the places where a lot of dissent and a lot of very subversive thinking happens. But I think that window will soon close for all the reasons I've outlined before that are linked to global economy and whatnot. So on this note, which I don't think is entirely pessimistic, because at least I left the window open, I will probably close, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.